All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, yesterday I covered in depth the structural factors the GOP faces for its re-election prospects in November, ultimately concluding, like Nate Silver has, that the party and Trump himself are basically at the complete mercy of events at this point. Coronavirus has to get a hell of a lot better, something needs to turn around on the economy, and some other Comey letter type action has to roil our domestic political situation. Now, those are pretty unlikely circumstances, which means the new fight in Washington is for the future of the Republican Party, which implicitly will be determining how exactly we feel about why Donald Trump lost if he is to lose. Is Trump a president who correctly tapped into a potent political force in 2016 before leading his administration astray and going down to defeat? Or is the platform he ran on in 2016 itself the issue that doomed that party? Now, a whole host of libertarian and corporate interests will have you believe the latter. It's the foundation of an ideology that cuts taxes in the morning, it ships jobs overseas at lunch, it starts a foreign war at dinner, and for dessert, it doesn't protect the social conservative interests of the voters that actually elevated them to office in the first place. It's an ideology that has been knowingly elevated by the mainstream media. It's the ideology of Rick Wilson, the Lincoln Project, who are unabashed supporters of the Iraq War and free trade, which ruined this country and put us on the road to Donald Trump in the first place. It's the ideology of Bill Kristol and others who should not be acceptable in polite society, but somehow continue to be, and they rule despite their hideous past positions. It's those people who I blame for what I'm about to show you, which by all appearances is a good faith attempt by some Gen Z Republican kids who want to reform and retake the Republican Party. Full disclosure, I think it's terrible and incredibly cringeworthy, but it's revealing as to what happens when you listen to the only conservatives who the so-called respectable media elevates and just how wrong they really are. So here's the ad, in full, by a group calling itself Gen Z GOP.
We've grown up in a wounded country
and faced daunting obstacles.
Some we've overcome. Others have only worsened.
Over the past few years, our political system has proven broken.
Our party hijacked.
Our values forgotten.
As Republicans, we believe that the party of Lincoln is worth saving from its current flirtation with authoritarian populism. But we do not seek to return to the politics of the past.
We seek to present a new vision. A vision that does not cave to the polarized choices of left and right, but one that embraces nuance, freedom, and opportunity.
We strive to be a GOP that pursues climate change solutions that harness American innovation and create green energy jobs.
A GOP that can embrace Americans of all backgrounds, proudly proclaim that Black Lives Matter, and work to combat injustice and inequality.
A GOP that engages private-public partnerships to provide accessible healthcare as a better alternative to the fiscal infeasibility of Medicare for all.
A GOP that embraces strong diplomacy and multilateral institutions to promote the global good and protect national interests, not self-interest.
A GOP that values the contributions of immigrants while pursuing bipartisan reform and modernizing border security.
And a GOP that promotes free trade and actually fights for fiscal responsibility.
We need to focus more on expert commentary that provides nuance, not one-dimensional talking heads who seek profits at the expense of a deceived and polarized public.
Once informed, we can find balance to formulate policies that consider the long-term implications for our generation.
We're launching Gen Z GOP because our generation needs a palatable alternative to the political left, which today's GOP has failed to provide.
It's up to our generation to do better for our party and our country.
With a new approach, we can truly achieve greatness in the future.
There's a lot going on in that ad. What strikes me was the opening image itself. The fact that we should recast the party in the image of George W. Bush, emulate Mitt Romney, have no distinction whatsoever with socially progressive liberals, and worship at the altar of so-called free trade and deficit hawkery. The one thing that also caught my eye was where they literally put in a video of a Predator drone taking off, because apparently what conservatism really is about endless war in the Middle East. Now, to be clear, I'm not dunking on the kids who made this ad. In fact, I even reached out to them. I asked asked them if they'd like to come on the show and discuss. But what I wanted to bring to all of you as evidence for how much damage the propaganda that we see pushed by neoliberals and neocons can do to normal people who want to do good in this world. The truth is that the agenda laid out in that video would appeal to absolutely no one. It's basically Bidenism light. And the reason that those kids believe that that's the path forward is that corporate elites who control the party are pushing nothing but lies right now. Donald Trump is losing the presidency badly, but amongst who? Well, risers already know this, but his starkest losses are not amongst black Americans or Latino Americans. No, it's amongst upper middle class white suburbanites. It's richer voters who are fleeing from Donald Trump, not poorer ones, along with seniors specifically for coronavirus. In fact, Trump is doing better this time around with black and Latino voters who are disproportionately more working class. And despite the fact that GOP party identification is at the same abysmal levels that it was at the tail end of George W. Bush's presidency, smart observers are beginning to see a trend. The remaining voters inside the coalition are working class. And if policy begins to reflect that, then a real political realignment could happen. Trump maintains a 20-point lead amongst non-college educated white voters. Now, that is not as good as it once was, but it's still 20 points up. And just as we've covered on this show, younger black voters who are more likely to support Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. But data also shows they're more likely than older black voters to be more Republican than they were in 2016. In fact, as Eric Leitz at New York Mag points out, quote, the Democratic Party boasts more support from affluent voters than at any time in its modern history. But Eric also points out that GOP policy is nowhere near more working class friendly. So if it wanted to create a Gen Z GOP, what would I do? And what should they do? Well, I and others should take notice that not all Gen Z kids are in college. In fact, more than half of them are working class. More than half of them are currently the most likely of any age group to be unemployed or face problems in the coronavirus economy. And I would say that the only absolute way for the party to exist in the future is not to sign those Gen Z kids up for another war or ship even more of their future jobs away to China or elsewhere in the world. And I'd say it's that their economic future and their cultural right to exist in this country, whose highest institutions are increasingly reflective of bourgeois liberals and not actual cultural positions held by your average American and who have never set foot on a college campus. Much of the so-called efforts to save the GOP from Trumpism are really just campaigns to be accepted by fellow liberals. And it's irresponsible of the media, GOP lawmakers, and others to propagate a myth of what is really wrong with the party today when the solution is staring us right in the face. And, you know, there's a lot of things going on in that ad, Crystal.
Yeah, there's a lot of work.
The W thing, the Predator drone is really what I think makes it, you know, the takeoff of that. But in general, like I said, I don't want to blame the people who made this ad. It's just this ideology is pushed by Rick Wilson and many others. It's like, oh, what we really need is to fight for free trade and deficit hawkery in order to win over Gen Z voters. I'm like, that just couldn't be farther from the case. Gen Z voters, I mean, the first thing we did here was talk about how Gen Z is now the most economically precarious generation.
Oh, yeah.
Even more so than the millennials, because they're entering into a stagnant economy that was devastated by 2008 and now destroyed by the coronavirus depression. I truly fear for their economic prospects over the next 15 years.
Yeah, well,
and that's just not the only way you can appeal to those people. It's not free trade and deficit hawkery. I can tell you that.
That's why you see you see a much more radical politics, frankly, coming out of Gen Z, even then. You know, millennials were like, oh my God, they're so progressive. And now it's like, oh, Gen Z is even more to the left on economic and social cultural issues. I see something different in that ad. I mean, the George W. Bush part from the jump, I was like, whoa, let's not go there. I just saw it as sort of confused.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and I could get behind, not get behind a GOP, but I could be okay with a two-party system that was like a Democratic Party that basically represents the Bernie left and a GOP that sort of occupies where Biden is and the sort of neoliberal Democratic establishment.
I don't want that.
I mean, let's not. But,
well, sure, you can get behind it.
But if that's like, you know, the way the conversation moved, then I'm okay with that vision. And that probably is somewhat close to what like a more conservative-minded Gen Z-er would want, where it's economically more like neoliberalism versus this just free market fundamentalism that's been in the GOP. But I think it's just all it doesn't have a coherent philosophy to it. And I also don't want to pick this apart or whatever. Right. But I think it just shows you there is a real crisis of thinking, of philosophy inside of especially the conservative economic sphere.
That's right. Which
is something I actually touch on my radar. They fit together pretty tightly because especially right now during this pandemic, you just see that the solutions they've been running on and offering and pushing relentlessly every time they get a chance at power, those things are all completely impotent and counterproductive in a moment like this. And so there's a need for a wholesale rethinking of what it looks like to have a conservative economic philosophy that also meets the challenges of the moment. And I don't think that anyone has really put that together. And you and others are trying to parse that out and how does it look? But it's it's very much a work much a work in progress, right? And so I kind of think, and by the way, I feel this on the Democratic Socialist side as well, that there's going to be a lot that needs to be reflected on and internalized that we are learning and things that we are seeing exposed in real time that are going to need to reshape all of our economic philosophies. And so when I look at that, I just see something that's sort of grabbing on to taglines and principles, but it doesn't actually cohere into something that could make sense as a vision for a party.
What I saw it is that these are well-meaning people look to people who are dissenters, right, from Trumpism. They're like, I don't like Trump, so what should I believe? What should the party go? So who do they have? Max Boot, Bill Kristol, Rick Wilson, the donors, all these other people who are pushing this libertine social agenda combined with libertarian economics. And it's literally the most underrepresented person in America is socially conservative and economically progressive. Mm-hmm. And you can see that again in the data, which we've pointed out here ad nauseum, which is that upper middle class white people are the ones who are saving Joe Biden. It's not any inroads in the Latino community, not any inroads in the black community. And Eric, who wrote that paper, actually name checks me as an example of why it's bad, which I thought was funny, in the New York Mag piece. But he essentially talks about the same thing, where he's like, look, actually older black or younger black voters are not nearly as tied to the Democratic Party in any way whatsoever. And there's a wholesale ability in order to win. Look, no one's going to say you're going to win the majority of the black vote. But 91% Democratic is not something that can hold, right? Unless with some serious efforts by people like Joe Biden and others. If GOP even wins 15, 20%, that's it, game over, right? It reshapes the entire electoral map in several states. And I just think that is the way that we should have to be thinking about it, which again is speaking into securing economic future for citizens, and also while not pushing a socially progressive agenda, which I know we disagree with. But that is the view that predominantly is held by so many people. And I also hate the way that we talk about Gen Z, because it's not just Gen Z kids who are in college.
Right.
Over half of these people are not in college. Many of them are working class and are actually the worst, most precarious moment of their careers, which is that they were just beginning to go into these lower wage jobs, whatever's left over from 2008, and now that's gone. And so for them, I really feel like that is the political opportunity, so to speak, for the future.
I think overall, that lane to me is clearly unoccupied and is part of to me, that is a major part of what Trump found success with.
Yes.
Was, at least rhetorically on the trail, getting to the left of Hillary on certain economic issues, having a clear sort of right-wing cultural stance. That definitely struck a chord with a large group of people who felt like no one had ever represented those views before. And it is a completely underrepresented group here in this. It's very hard to come up with even 5 names of people who represent that perspective really and truly here in this town. For Gen Z, though, it's an incredibly progressive generation. Not to say that there aren't people that hold socially conservative views in Gen Z, but they are overwhelmingly more liberal, more progressive across the board. They're less likely to affiliate themselves with the Democratic Party.
Any party.
Or any party, right? It's a much more free-thinking group of people, which I think is a fantastic thing. But if you're explicitly like looking to appeal to Gen Z voters, I think you're going to have a hard time outside of a relatively, small minority if you are going hardline on social conservative issues. So that's kind of the conundrum for the Republican Party in a lot of ways is, what is that coalition that you build? What does it look like? Do you try to win younger generations over? Do you try to center on maybe older working class voters? I think there's a huge unexploited opportunity for both parties with Latinos in particular who really respond to like a trade message and an economic message, a healthcare message. I mean, that's a big part of why Bernie Sanders was so popular there.
Many of them are Catholic.
That is true as well. And, there's a real like family-centric focus there as well. So there's an unexploited opportunity, but it's all this question of like, what is the coalition going to look like? And that's ultimately what it comes down to. And that's what we talk so much about the Democratic Party here. They've clearly centered themselves around the values of white, upper class, like affluent suburbanites, and that leads to a very specific politics. But for the GOP, it's kind of like,
and the Republicans are like, no, we want to be the party of the upper middle class white people. And I'm like, no, there's a whole other group of people in this country. All right, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.